The cabin sat like a forgotten secret among the towering pines of the Colorado Rockies, its windows dark and welcoming to a desperate woman with nowhere else to go. Sarah Chen pressed her hand against her swollen belly, feeling her baby kick as she stepped onto the creaking porch, snow crunching beneath her worn boots. Fired from her investigative journalism job for asking too many questions, evicted from her apartment and abandoned by her ex-boyfriend, this abandoned shelter seemed like divine intervention. But Sarah's relief turned to ice when she found the photographs hidden beneath loose floorboards. Pictures of her apartment, pictures of her walking to work. The cabin wasn't abandoned, it was a trap, and the man who owned it, tech mogul Marcus Vail, had supposedly died in a plane crash 6 months ago. Yet his coffee cup was still warm on the kitchen table. Someone had been watching her long before she lost everything. Someone had orchestrated her downfall to bring her here. But why would a dead man want a pregnant journalist in his mountain hideaway? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's hands trembled as she scattered the photographs across the dusty wooden table. Each image was time-stamped, going back nearly 8 months, before she'd even started investigating the corruption scandal at Vail Industries that had cost her everything. In one photo, she was buying prenatal vitamins at the pharmacy. In another, she was arguing with David outside their apartment building the night he walked out on her. The baby shifted restlessly inside her, as if sensing her terror. 7 months pregnant with nowhere to run, exhausted from the treacherous mountain drive that had drained her last tank of gas, she was trapped. The nearest town was 40 miles down a winding road that would be impassable in her ancient Honda if the storm brewing overhead unleashed its fury. She picked up the coffee cup with shaking fingers. The ceramic was warm, the liquid inside still steaming. Whoever had been here had left recently. Were they watching her now through the darkened windows? Her eyes darted to the shadows beyond the glass, but the forest revealed nothing. A manila folder sat open on the counter, and her name was written across the tab in bold black letters. Inside she found copies of her termination letter, her eviction notice, even her medical records from her last prenatal appointment. Someone had documented her destruction with clinical precision. At the bottom of the folder lay a newspaper clipping about Marcus Vail's death. The tech billionaire's private jet had crashed into the Pacific during a storm. His body never recovered. The investigation had been closed quickly, too quickly, Sarah realized with her journalist's instincts. She'd been so consumed with her own investigation into his company's financial irregularities that she'd barely paid attention to his death. Her smartphone showed no signal, as expected in these remote mountains. The cabin's landline was dead. She was completely cut off from the outside world, exactly as someone had planned. Sarah forced herself to think logically despite the panic clawing at her chest. She'd been investigating Vail Industries' suspicious government contracts when she'd been fired. Her editor had claimed budget cuts, but Sarah knew the truth. Someone had pressured the newspaper to silence her. The story she'd been chasing involved millions in diverted federal funds and technology transfers that made no sense. Now Marcus Vail, supposedly dead, had been monitoring her every move. But why? What had she stumbled onto that was worth orchestrating such an elaborate trap? A floorboard creaked somewhere in the cabin's depths. Sarah froze, listening. The sound came again, deliberate and measured. Footsteps. Someone else was here. She grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter, her pregnant belly making her movements clumsy. The footsteps grew closer, coming from a hallway she hadn't yet explored. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed herself against the wall beside the kitchen doorway. Sarah. The voice was male, calm, and terrifyingly familiar. She'd heard it before in interviews, on news programs. Marcus Vail's voice. "I know you're frightened, but I need you to listen to me." A tall figure appeared in the doorway, and Sarah's breath caught. It was him, Marcus Vail, very much alive, his dark hair longer than in his corporate photos, a beard obscuring his sharp features. He raised his hand slowly, showing he was unarmed. "You're supposed to be dead," Sarah whispered, the knife shaking in her grip. "I am dead, officially." His eyes were intense but not unkind. "And after what I'm about to tell you, you might wish you'd never found this place. But you're the only journalist I trust to help me expose the truth." "The truth about what?" "About why they want me dead, about why they've been watching you, and about the real reason you lost everything." He stepped closer, and Sarah saw something unexpected in his expression: desperation. "Someone is selling American secrets to foreign governments, Sarah, and they're using my technology to do it." The morning sun filtered through the cabin's dusty windows, casting long shadows across the hardwood floor. Sarah had barely slept, her mind churning with questions about the photograph she'd discovered. The missing billionaire's face haunted her thoughts as she made instant coffee with trembling hands, her pregnancy-swollen belly making even simple movements awkward. She'd heard of Marcus Holloway, of course. Everyone had. The tech mogul who'd vanished without a trace 6 months ago, leaving behind a fortune and more questions than answers. The media had speculated endlessly: suicide, kidnapping, voluntary disappearance. But seeing his face in that family photo, standing in this very room, made everything feel suddenly terrifyingly real. Her phone buzzed, startling her. A text from her sister Claire: "Haven't heard from you. Everything okay?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, "Call me if you need anything. Love you." Sarah's eyes welled with tears. She desperately wanted to call Claire, to hear her sister's rational voice cutting through the chaos in her head. But involving Claire would only put her in danger too. Derek had connections, the kind that came from years of law enforcement work before he'd been quietly forced out for reasons he'd never explained. She wandered through the cabin, looking for more clues about its true owner. In the bedroom, she found clothes in the closet, expensive but casual pieces that would fit Marcus's build. The dresser drawers revealed more personal items: a watch that probably cost more than her annual salary, prescription glasses, and tucked beneath some sweaters, a leather journal. Her hands shook as she opened it. The entries were brief, written in Marcus's distinctive handwriting she recognized from countless business magazine features. Most were mundane, meeting notes, travel plans, random thoughts. But as she flipped toward the more recent entries, the tone shifted. "Her getting closer. Elena thinks I'm paranoid, but the audit uncovered things that should have stayed buried." Mitchell called again. "Says he can't protect me much longer. The board is asking questions. If something happens to me, I hope someone finds this place. The truth needs to come out." Sarah's blood ran cold. The final entry was dated just 3 days before Marcus Holloway's disappearance. "Moving the files tonight. If they want to silence me, they'll have to find me first. The cabin should be safe. Only 3 people know about it, and I trust them with my life. God help me, I hope I'm wrong about this." A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on gravel. A car door slamming. Sarah crept to the window, keeping low. A black SUV sat in the driveway, its engine still running. 2 men in dark suits stood beside it, one speaking into a phone while the other surveyed the cabin. They looked like federal agents, but something about their demeanor felt wrong. Too casual, too predatory. "The car's not here," one called to the other. "Maybe she moved on. Boss wants us to check anyway. She's got to be running out of places to hide." Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. They were looking for her, but how had they found this place? She'd been so careful, paying cash for gas, avoiding highways with cameras, unless Derek. Somehow he'd tracked her here. She grabbed the journal and the photograph, stuffing them into her backpack along with the few belongings she'd brought. The men were approaching the front door now, their footsteps heavy on the wooden porch. "Sarah Chen," one called out. "We know you're in there. Come out and we can discuss this civilly." The use of her full name confirmed her worst fears. These weren't random thugs. They knew exactly who she was and why she was running. Moving as quietly as possible, she slipped toward the back of the cabin. There was a rear exit through the kitchen that led into dense woods. If she could reach her car, which she'd hidden behind a stand of trees a quarter-mile away, the front door exploded inward with a thunderous crash. "Search every room," a voice commanded. "And remember, she's pregnant. We need her alive." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She slipped out the back door and ran into the forest, clutching her backpack and praying that whatever Marcus Holloway had discovered was worth the price they were all apparently going to pay for it. The morning light filtered through the cabin's dusty windows as Sarah carefully examined the framed photograph she'd found. Marcus Blackwood stood beside a sleek yacht, his arm around a woman with platinum blonde hair and cold blue eyes. The woman's smile seemed forced, her posture rigid despite the casual beach setting. Sarah recognized her immediately from the news coverage. Victoria Blackwood, Marcus's wife, who had been notably absent from most press conferences about her husband's disappearance. Sarah's stomach churned, and not just from morning sickness. She set the frame down with trembling fingers and moved to the kitchen, hoping to find something to settle her nerves. The refrigerator hummed quietly, still stocked with expensive imported water and artisanal condiments that hadn't yet expired. Someone had been maintaining this place recently. As she reached for a bottle of water, a sound outside made her freeze. The distant rumble of an engine echoed through the trees, growing closer. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she crept to the window and peered through a gap in the curtains. A black SUV with tinted windows was making its way up the narrow dirt road that led to the cabin. Panic seized her. She grabbed her backpack and stuffed it with the few supplies she'd unpacked, her movements quick and desperate. The engine noise grew louder, closer. Through the window, she could see the vehicle was less than 100 yards away. Sarah bolted toward the back door but stopped when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Fresh tire tracks in the mud outside led directly to a wooden shed she hadn't noticed before. The tracks were recent, made within the last day or two. Someone else had been here, and recently. The SUV's engine cut off. Car doors slammed shut. Voices carried on the morning air, at least 2 men, maybe 3. Sarah couldn't make out their words, but their tone was businesslike, purposeful. These weren't casual hikers who'd stumbled upon the property. "Doors unlocked," a gruff voice said. "That's not how we left it." "Someone's been here," another man replied, his accent suggesting money and education. "Check everything. If Blackwood came back—" "Blackwood's fish food," the first voice interrupted. "Has been for weeks. This is someone else." Sarah pressed her hand over her mouth to muffle her breathing. Through the closet's slanted wooden slats, she could see boots moving across the hardwood floor. The men were systematic in their search, opening drawers, checking cabinets, examining everything with practiced efficiency. "Sir, you need to see this," a third voice called from the kitchen. "Someone's been eating the food, drinking the water. Recent, maybe yesterday." The educated voice grew sharp with authority. "Find them. Check the perimeter, the shed, everywhere. And call Henderson. Tell him we have a problem." One set of footsteps headed toward the back door, while another climbed the stairs above Sarah's hiding spot. The third man remained in the main room, and Sarah could hear him speaking quietly into a phone. "Yes, sir. I understand the timeline," he was saying. "But if someone's discovered the cabin, if they've seen the files—" "No, sir, of course not. We'll handle it quietly." "Files." Sarah's mind raced. What files? She thought about the photograph, the expensive furnishings, the way these men spoke about Marcus Blackwood as if his death was a certainty rather than a mystery. Nothing about this felt like a missing person case anymore. The man on the phone moved closer to her hiding spot. Through the slats, Sarah could see expensive shoes and the hem of a tailored coat. When he spoke again, his voice was directly above her. "The election's in 6 weeks," he continued. "Senator Morrison can't afford any complications now. Yes, I know what's at stake. Blackwood should have kept his mouth shut about the development contracts." Senator Morrison. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew that name. Everyone in the state did. James Morrison was running for governor, leading in all the polls. His campaign had been built on a platform of environmental protection and government transparency. "Found something!" The shout came from outside, near the shed. Fresh footprints leading into the woods, small, maybe a woman. "Can't be more than a few hours old." The man above Sarah cursed softly. "Track them," he ordered into the phone, "and bring the dogs. Whoever this is, they know too much to walk away." Sarah's protective instincts flared as she instinctively placed a hand over her still flat stomach. Whatever Marcus Blackwood had discovered, whatever had gotten him killed, she was now part of it, and these men would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. The first newspaper clipping was dated 3 months ago. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the headline, "Tech mogul Marcus Blackwood, missing after yacht explosion." The accompanying photo showed a man in his 50s with steel-grey hair and penetrating blue eyes, standing beside what appeared to be the same stone fireplace she'd been warming herself by for the past 2 days. She spread the other clippings across the oak desk like tarot cards, revealing an ominous future. Each article painted a darker picture than the last. Blackwood Industries stock plummeting, federal investigations into government contracts, whistleblower allegations of illegal weapons testing. And through it all, Marcus Blackwood had simply vanished, presumed dead when his yacht exploded off the coast of Maine. But the cabin told a different story. This wasn't the retreat of a dead man. It was a hideout. Sarah's breath caught as she noticed something else. Fresh coffee grounds in the kitchen trash, barely concealed beneath yesterday's newspaper. Her blood turned to ice. Someone had been here recently. Very recently. The baby kicked, and she pressed her hand to her swollen belly, trying to steady her racing heart. She needed to think clearly, but panic was creeping in like fog through the trees outside. If Blackwood was alive and using this cabin, where was he now? More importantly, when would he return? She forced herself to keep searching, driven by an instinct she couldn't name. In the bedroom dresser, beneath carefully folded sweaters, she found a manila envelope sealed with tape. Inside were documents that made her stomach lurch, architectural blueprints for something called Project Lazarus, financial transfers to offshore accounts, and a list of names with dollar amounts beside them. At the top of the list was a name that made her knees buckle, Senator Patricia Reynolds, the woman currently leading the Senate investigation into Blackwood Industries. $20 million. Sarah sank onto the bed, the implications washing over her in waves. This wasn't just about a missing billionaire. This was about corruption at the highest levels of government. But why keep these documents here? Why not destroy them? Unless they were insurance. A sound outside made her freeze. Footsteps on gravel, slow, deliberate, approaching the front door. Sarah's mind went blank with terror. She clutched the documents to her chest, looking frantically around the room. The window. Could she fit through it in her condition? The footsteps stopped at the door, and she heard the scrape of a key in the lock. Moving faster than she thought possible, Sarah shoved the documents back into the envelope and stuffed it under the mattress. She grabbed the newspaper clippings, her heart hammering so loud she was certain whoever was outside could hear it. The front door opened with a creak that seemed to echo through her bones. "I know someone's here," a man's voice called out, cultured but edged with exhaustion. "I can smell the fire." Sarah pressed herself against the bedroom wall, barely breathing. Through the crack beneath the door, she could see a shadow moving across the living room floor. The voice matched the man in the photographs. Marcus Blackwood was alive, and he was here. "Look, I'm not going to hurt you," he continued, and Sarah heard him moving closer to the bedroom. "I just want to know who you are and what you're doing in my cabin." She closed her eyes, knowing she was trapped. In her condition, there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The baby seemed to sense her fear, shifting restlessly as if trying to find safety in her womb. The bedroom door handle turned. Marcus Blackwood stood in the doorway, and Sarah's first thought was how different he looked from his corporate photos. His hair was longer, streaked with more grey, and his face was gaunt with the hollow look of a man who hadn't slept peacefully in months. But his eyes were the same, sharp, calculating, missing nothing. Those eyes took in everything. Her obvious pregnancy, her disheveled appearance, the way she instinctively stepped back toward the window. When his gaze fell on the newspaper clippings still clutched in her hand, his expression hardened. "So," he said quietly, "you know who I am." Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Everyone thinks you're dead. Everyone is supposed to think I'm dead." He stepped into the room, and she noticed he kept his hands visible, non-threatening. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The weight of the envelope beneath the mattress seemed to burn through the fabric, and Sarah realized with crystal clarity that her life had just become infinitely more complicated. This man was either a criminal or a target, possibly both, and now she was the only person who knew the truth. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows like a warning of the storm to come. The photograph trembled in Sarah's hands as she stared at the familiar face smiling back at her from what was clearly this very cabin. Marcus Holloway stood beside the stone fireplace she'd been warming herself by for 3 days, his arm around a woman Sarah didn't recognize. The timestamp showed the photo was taken just 6 months ago. Her breath caught as the implications crashed over her like a cold wave. This wasn't some random mountain retreat. This was the private hideaway of one of the most powerful men in the country, a man who'd vanished without a trace 3 weeks ago, sparking a media frenzy and FBI investigation that dominated every news channel. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where her 5-month pregnancy was just beginning to show. She'd thought she'd found salvation in this remote cabin when her car broke down during the blizzard. Now she wondered if she'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than the storm outside. The photo album slipped from her lap as she stood, scattering images across the hardwood floor. More pictures revealed themselves, Marcus with various people, some she recognized from business magazines, others who looked like they belonged in government buildings rather than rustic mountain cabins. There were documents too, mixed among the photos, bearing official seals and marked with red confidential stamps. A particular document caught her eye, and she bent to retrieve it despite her protesting back. The letterhead belonged to Meridian Industries, the massive defense contractor that had been in the news lately for all the wrong reasons. Congressional hearings about overcharging the military, whispers of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. The letter was addressed to Marcus personally, and even Sarah's untrained eye could see it was explosive. References to adjusted pricing schedules and anticipated cooperation from our friends in procurement painted a clear picture of systematic fraud. At the bottom, a handwritten note in the margin made her blood run cold. "Senator Williams has agreed to kill the investigation. Payment, as discussed." Sarah sank back into the leather chair, her mind racing. Senator Williams chaired the Defense Appropriations Committee. She'd seen him on the news just last week, righteously declaring his commitment to rooting out waste and corruption in military spending. The hypocrisy would have been laughable if it wasn't so terrifying. Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, but Sarah barely noticed. She was thinking about Marcus Holloway's disappearance now, seeing it in an entirely different light. The official story was that he'd gone sailing alone and never returned, his yacht found empty and drifting off the California coast. But what if he hadn't disappeared at all? What if he'd been disappeared? Her phone buzzed, startling her. The screen showed a text from her sister, saw the weather report. "Hope you made it somewhere, safe. Call when you can." Sarah stared at the message, suddenly realizing how isolated she truly was. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the storm had knocked out the landline she'd noticed in the kitchen. Her cell service was spotty at best, and she'd been rationing her battery since arriving. She gathered the scattered documents with shaking hands, her mind cataloging what she was seeing: bank routing numbers, payment schedules, names of military officials she recognized from news reports. This wasn't just about overcharging for contracts. This was evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military leadership. A new sound made her freeze, the distant rumble of an engine. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, or perhaps machinery from a neighboring property. But as it grew closer, there was no mistaking the deliberate approach of vehicles on the access road. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as she rushed to the window, peering through the heavy curtains. Through the swirling snow she could make out headlights, multiple sets, moving slowly but purposefully up the winding mountain road toward the cabin. They'd found her. Somehow, impossibly, they'd found her. She looked down at the documents still clutched in her hands, then at her phone showing no signal bars. The reality of her situation crystallized with brutal clarity. She was alone, pregnant, and trapped in a blizzard with evidence that powerful people had already killed to protect. The engine sounds grew louder, closer. Sarah estimated she had maybe 5 minutes before they reached the cabin. 5 minutes to decide whether to hide the evidence and play innocent or to run into a storm that could kill her and her unborn child. But as she looked at the documents again, at the proof of corruption that had probably cost Marcus Holloway his life, she realized she might not have a choice. These people hadn't come all the way up a mountain in a blizzard to have a conversation. The storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie silence that seemed to press against the cabin walls. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching ice-laden branches catch the pale morning light. 3 days had passed since she'd discovered Marcus Blackwood's identity, and the isolation was beginning to feel less like refuge and more like a trap. She'd spent hours poring over the documents hidden in the desk, each revelation more disturbing than the last. Blackwood Industries wasn't just a tech conglomerate. It was a network of shell companies, offshore accounts and contracts with government agencies whose names were redacted in thick black ink. The deeper she dug, the more she understood why someone might want Marcus Blackwood to disappear. The baby kicked, a sharp reminder of the life growing inside her. At 6 months pregnant, she couldn't ignore the physical demands much longer. Her ankles were swollen, her back ached constantly, and the prenatal vitamins she'd found in the cabin's medicine chest were nearly gone. She needed proper medical care, but the thought of leaving this sanctuary terrified her. A sound outside made her freeze. Not the settling of snow or the crack of winter-stressed wood, something else, something deliberate. Sarah moved away from the window, her heart hammering. She'd been so careful, keeping the curtains drawn, using candles instead of electric lights after dark. The generator hummed quietly in the basement, but from the outside the cabin should look abandoned. The sound came again. Footsteps crunching through snow. Panic flooded her system as she remembered the photographs she'd left, scattered across the dining table. Evidence of Marcus Blackwood's secret life spread out like an accusation. She rushed to gather them, shoving papers into folders, her hands shaking. A knock at the front door stopped her cold. "Hello? Anyone there?" The voice was male, authoritative but not threatening. "I'm with the county sheriff's office, just doing a wellness check." "Ma'am, I can see smoke from the chimney. I know someone's inside." She closed her eyes, weighing her options. Running wasn't feasible, not in her condition, not in this weather. Hiding would only make her look more suspicious, and if this really was a sheriff's deputy, refusing to answer might bring more attention than she could handle. "Just a moment," she called out, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. She quickly swept the remaining papers into a kitchen drawer, then smoothed her hair and approached the door. Through the peephole, she could see a man in a brown uniform coat, a star-shaped badge visible on his chest. He looked to be in his 50s, with graying hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. Sarah opened the door part way, keeping the chain latch engaged. "Can I help you?" "Deputy Carl Morrison, ma'am. Sorry to bother you, but we had reports of someone potentially in distress up here. Just wanted to make sure everything's all right." "I'm fine, thank you. Just waiting out the storm." The deputy's gaze dropped to her visible pregnancy, and his expression softened with concern. "You're staying up here alone? In your condition?" "I'm managing just fine." She tried to project confidence she didn't feel. "The cabin belongs to a friend." "Mind if I ask which friend?" "We keep tabs on the seasonal residents, especially during weather like this." Sarah's pulse quickened. She couldn't claim to know Marcus Blackwood. That would raise too many questions. But lying to a police officer felt dangerous too. "I'd rather not say. He values his privacy." Deputy Morrison nodded slowly, but she could see him processing her evasion. Well, ma'am, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but we've got another storm system moving in. Could be worse than the last one. You might want to consider coming down to town until it passes. That's very kind, but I'm comfortable here. What about medical care? You look like you're pretty far along. The concern in his voice seemed genuine, which somehow made this more difficult. Sarah found herself wanting to trust him, to confess everything and let someone else shoulder the burden of what she'd discovered. But the memory of those government contracts, those redacted agency names, held her back. "I have everything I need," she said firmly. Deputy Morrison reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a business card. "Well, if you change your mind or if you need anything at all, here's my number. We've got four-wheel drive vehicles that can get up here even in bad weather." Sarah took the card, their fingers brushing briefly. "Thank you. Take care of yourself, ma'am. And that baby." She watched through the window as he trudged back to his patrol vehicle, noting how he paused to examine the tire tracks her rental car had left in the snow. When his taillights finally disappeared down the mountain road, Sarah slumped against the door, emotionally drained. The deputy's visit had shaken her more than she wanted to admit. If law enforcement was checking on remote cabins, how long before someone else came looking? The morning light revealed what Sarah had missed in the darkness. Tire tracks leading away from the cabin, partially obscured by fallen leaves but still visible in the soft earth. Her stomach churned as she knelt beside them, her pregnant belly making the movement awkward. The tracks were fresh, maybe a day or two old at most. Someone had been here recently. Sarah's hands trembled as she traced the deep grooves with her finger. The tread pattern was distinctive, expensive looking. Not the kind of tires you'd find on a park ranger's vehicle or a hiker's beat-up truck. These belonged to something luxury, something that cost more than most people made in a year. She followed the tracks to where they disappeared onto the main trail, her mind racing. Had someone been watching her? The thought sent ice through her veins. She'd felt so safe here, so hidden, but if people were coming and going, if this place wasn't as abandoned as it seemed... Back inside the cabin, Sarah's eyes swept over everything with new suspicion. The dust patterns on the shelves, were they really undisturbed? That book she'd found face down on the coffee table, the one about offshore banking, had it always been there? And the fireplace, the ashes she'd assumed were old, when had that fire actually burned? Her phone buzzed with another unknown number. Sarah stared at it, her heart hammering. She'd been getting these calls for 3 days now, ever since she'd found the documents. Each time she let it go to voicemail, and each time there was nothing but silence on the recording. This time, she answered. "Hello?" The line went dead. Sarah dropped the phone like it had burned her. They knew. Somehow they knew exactly what she'd found and where she was. The walls of the cabin suddenly felt like they were closing in, the windows like watching eyes. She grabbed the manila envelope and stuffed it into her backpack along with the few belongings she'd accumulated. Her movements were frantic now, driven by pure survival instinct. She had to get out, had to get somewhere public, somewhere safe. But as she reached for the door handle, she froze. Through the window she could see a black SUV parked at the trailhead, maybe 200 yards away. It hadn't been there 10 minutes ago when she'd checked the tire tracks. 2 figures sat in the front seats, too far away to make out clearly, but their stillness was predatory. Waiting. Sarah backed away from the window, her breathing shallow. They were watching the cabin. Maybe they'd been watching it all along, waiting to see what she would do, what she would take. The phone call hadn't been a warning, it had been a test. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, staying low, keeping away from the windows. There had to be another way out. The back door led to dense forest, but that would mean abandoning her car, abandoning any chance of quick escape. And in her condition, how far could she really run? The documents in her backpack felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Every instinct screamed at her to destroy them, to burn the evidence and pretend she'd never seen any of it. But the names on those papers, the amounts of money, the implications of what Richard Holbrook had been involved in, this wasn't just about her anymore. People had died for this information. People were still dying. Her baby kicked, a sharp jab against her ribs that made her gasp. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the solid reality of the life growing inside her. This child would be born into a world where powerful men could disappear anyone who threatened them, where truth was a luxury that could cost everything, unless someone stood up to them. Sarah's phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from the same unknown number. Last chance. Walk away. She stared at the message, her fear crystallizing into something harder, more determined. They were threatening her, yes, but they were also afraid. Afraid enough to watch her, to follow her, to try intimidating her instead of simply making her disappear. That meant she had something they couldn't just take by force. She had leverage. Moving carefully to the back window, Sarah peered through the trees. The forest was thick but not impassable. She could see glimpses of another trail, one that wound around the mountain instead of down to the parking area. It would be harder, more dangerous in her condition, but it might be her only chance. She typed a quick response to the text, "I need more time to think." Then she turned off her phone, shouldered her backpack, and slipped out the back door into the forest. Behind her, the black SUV continued its patient vigil, its occupants unaware that their prey had already vanished into the wilderness. The real game was just beginning. The manila folder trembled in Sarah's hands as she spread its contents across the kitchen table. Bank statements, wire transfer records, and correspondence painted a picture that made her stomach churn. Marcus Blackwood hadn't just disappeared, he'd been systematically erased. The first document showed a wire transfer of $50 million to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands, dated 3 days before Blackwood's supposed vanishing. But the signature looked wrong, the pen strokes too deliberate, too careful. Sarah had worked in financial services long enough to recognize a forgery when she saw one. Her phone buzzed, another unknown number. She'd been getting calls every hour since yesterday, each one going straight to voicemail. She didn't dare answer them. Thunder rumbled overhead as she examined a letter from Blackwood's business partner, Victoria Chen. The letterhead was elegant, expensive, but the message was chilling. "Marcus, your decision to liquidate the environmental fund concerns the board. We need to discuss this immediately." The date stamp showed it was written 2 weeks after Blackwood had allegedly sent the wire transfer. A photograph slipped from between 2 bank statements. She gasped. It showed Blackwood with a woman she recognized from the news, Senator Patricia Hawthorne, chair of the Senate Environmental Committee. They were shaking hands in front of what looked like a chemical plant, both smiling for the camera. Blackwood appeared healthy and very much alive, but the timestamp read 6 months after his disappearance. The implications crashed over her like a cold wave. If Blackwood was alive 6 months after vanishing, then everything else was a lie. The missing person reports, the police investigation, the media coverage, all of it orchestrated. Rain began pelting the windows harder now, and Sarah realized the storm had intensified while she'd been reading. She gathered the documents, her mind racing. She needed to photograph everything, create backups, find a way to get this information to someone who could act on it. But as she reached for her phone, headlights swept across the living room window. Sarah's blood froze. She'd been so careful, so isolated. No one should know about this place except... The engine cut off. Car doors slammed. Moving as quietly as possible, Sarah stuffed the documents back into the folder and looked frantically around the cabin. The bedroom would trap her. The bathroom had no window. Her only option was the back door, but that would mean going out into the storm. Heavy footsteps crossed the front porch. Sarah clutched the folder and moved toward the kitchen's rear exit, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "Sarah Martinez?" a man's voice called through the front door. "We know you're in there. We just want to talk." She didn't believe that for a second. People who just wanted to talk didn't show up in the middle of a thunderstorm at a remote cabin. The back door opened silently under her touch. Rain immediately soaked her clothes as she stepped onto the small back porch. Lightning illuminated the forest beyond, showing her a narrow path she'd noticed during her walks. If she could reach the trees, she might have a chance. Behind her, something heavy hit the front door. They weren't waiting for her permission anymore. Sarah ran. The forest floor was treacherous in the rain, roots and rocks hidden by darkness and fallen leaves. She stumbled repeatedly, the folder pressed against her chest, branches catching at her clothes and hair. The baby made her clumsy, her center of gravity all wrong, but terror kept her moving. Shouts erupted from the cabin behind her. Flashlight beams began sweeping through the trees, getting closer. Sarah pressed herself against a massive oak, trying to control her breathing, trying to think. Her phone had GPS. They could track her as long as she carried it. With shaking fingers, she pulled it out and powered it down, then buried it in the wet leaves at the base of the tree. The folder was more important than any phone. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, she saw them. 3 figures moving through the forest, spreading out to cover more ground, professional, methodical. These weren't random criminals. They were hunters, and she was prey. Sarah moved deeper into the woods, forcing herself to step carefully despite every instinct screaming at her to run. One mistake, one turned ankle, and it would all be over. The rain intensified, turning the forest floor into a muddy nightmare. But it also masked her footsteps and made the flashlight beams less effective. Nature was giving her what little advantage it could. She had to survive this, had to protect the life growing inside her, had to make sure the truth in that folder saw daylight. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, as if agreeing. Sarah's hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the weight of Marcus Chen's words settling like lead in her stomach. The baby kicked, as if sensing her distress, and she pressed a protective hand to her belly. 24 hours. That's all the time she had before Chen would assume she'd been compromised and disappear forever, taking the only evidence of Blackwood Industries' crimes with him. She closed the laptop and paced the cabin's small living room, her mind racing through possibilities. Every option seemed to lead to the same conclusion. She couldn't do this alone. The conspiracy was too vast, too well protected. But who could she trust? The local police were likely compromised, and federal authorities would take days to mobilize if they believed her at all. A memory surfaced from her journalism days. Jake Morrison, an investigative reporter for the Washington Herald, who'd helped her with a corruption story years ago. He was tenacious, well-connected, and most importantly, he owed her a favor. Sarah grabbed her phone, then hesitated. Every call was a risk, but staying silent guaranteed failure. She dialed Jake's number, her heart hammering as it rang. Sarah Chen. Jesus, I thought you were dead. Jake's voice carried genuine relief. The news said you were in some kind of accident up north. Jake, I need help. Real help. But first, are you somewhere you can talk privately? A pause. Give me 2 minutes. Sarah counted each second until he came back on the line. Okay, I'm secure. What's going on? I'm alive, obviously, but barely. I've stumbled onto something huge. Blackwood Industries is involved in human trafficking, and they've killed at least 3 people to cover it up, including Richard Blackwood himself. Slow down. Richard Blackwood is missing, not dead. No, Jake, he's dead. Murdered by his own security team. I have video evidence, financial records, everything. But the people behind this have resources I can't fight alone. She heard Jake typing furiously. Where are you? Sarah looked out the window at the endless forest. Blackwood's cabin in northern Maine. Jake, they tried to kill me. If I come forward, they'll try again. Then don't come forward. Not yet. Send me everything you have, encrypted, through the secure channel we used before. I'll start building a story, getting federal attention. Once we have protection in place, then you surface. Relief flooded through her. You believe me? Sarah, you're many things, but crazy isn't one of them. Besides, I've been hearing whispers about Blackwood Industries for months. Missing persons cases that got buried, shipping manifests that don't add up. Your story connects dots I couldn't link before. Sarah was already moving toward the laptop. I'm sending files now. Jake, there's something else. I'm 6 months pregnant. The silence stretched long enough that Sarah wondered if the call had dropped. Christ, Sarah. Okay, that changes things. We need to move fast but carefully. I'm calling in favors with the FBI, specifically someone I trust in their human trafficking division. Agent Patricia Reeves. She's clean. I'd stake my career on it. As Sarah uploaded the encrypted files, a new sound reached her ears, the distant rumble of vehicles approaching on the access road. Her blood turned to ice. Jake, they're here. They found me. How long do you have? Sarah peered through the window, counting headlights. 3 vehicles, moving slowly but deliberately up the winding road. Maybe 5 minutes. Listen carefully. There's a hiking trail behind most of these remote cabins, emergency evacuation route. Follow it north for exactly 2 miles, then east until you hit Route 201. I'm dispatching Agent Reeves to intercept you there. What if she's not? Sarah, you have to trust someone. Reeves will be in a black SUV, federal plates. She'll flash her headlights 3 times when she sees you. The code phrase is, Jake sent me for the Chen story. If anyone else approaches, run. The vehicles were closer now, their engines echoing off the surrounding hills. Sarah grabbed the laptop, her jacket, and the few supplies she could carry. Her body protested the sudden movement, the baby's weight throwing off her balance. Files are uploaded, she whispered into the phone. Jake, if something happens to me, nothing's going to happen. You're going to get out of there, we're going to nail these bastards, and you're going to have a beautiful, healthy baby. Now go. Sarah ended the call and slipped out the cabin's back door, melting into the forest shadows just as the first vehicle's headlights swept across the front windows. Behind her, she could hear car doors slamming, voices shouting orders. They'd discovered the cabin was empty, but it wouldn't take long for them to find her trail. The hiking path was barely visible in the moonlight, but Sarah pressed forward, one hand on her belly, the other clutching the laptop that contained the evidence to bring down a conspiracy. Each step took her deeper into the unknown, but for the first time in days, she felt something she'd almost forgotten: hope. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Sarah clutched it against her chest, her heart hammering so violently she was certain it could be heard echoing through the cabin's thin walls. Marcus stood frozen by the window, his knuckles white against the curtain's edge as he peered into the darkness beyond. How many? She whispered, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. 3 vehicles, maybe more. His voice carried a grim finality that made her stomach lurch. They're not trying to hide anymore. Sarah's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby seemed to sense her terror, shifting restlessly beneath her ribs. Everything they'd discovered about Blackwater Industries, about the murdered whistleblowers, about the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, it was all in that envelope. And now the very people who'd killed to protect those secrets had found them. The back exit, Marcus said, already moving toward the kitchen. There's a trail that leads to the old mining road. If we can reach my truck... The sharp crack of splintering wood cut him off. Sarah spun toward the front door, watching in horror as it buckled inward under some tremendous force. Shouts erupted from outside, harsh voices barking orders she couldn't quite make out over the blood rushing in her ears. Sarah's mind raced through their dwindling options. The storm cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards was too obvious. The attic crawl space would trap them like rats. Her gaze fell on the stone fireplace, remembering something Marcus had mentioned about the cabin's construction. The chimney, she hissed. You said there was a hidden compartment for hiding moonshine, not people. But Marcus was already moving, pulling away the metal screen and peering up into the darkness. It's narrow. With the baby, it's our only chance. The front door exploded inward with a thunderous crash. Heavy boots stomped across the threshold as Sarah stuffed the envelope inside her jacket and squeezed into the fireplace opening. The stone was rough against her back, scraping through her clothes as Marcus helped push her up into the chimney's narrow confines. The space was impossibly tight, forcing her to turn sideways to accommodate her pregnant belly. Ancient soot rained down, coating her hair and filling her nostrils with the acrid smell of decades-old smoke. Below, she could hear voices growing closer, systematic and professional. Check every room, every closet, every floorboard. The voice was cultured, educated, not what she'd expected from hired killers. It made the situation somehow more terrifying, this clinical precision in their hunt for her. Marcus squeezed up behind her, his larger frame making the space even more cramped. His breathing was labored, whether from exertion or fear she couldn't tell. Through the narrow gap where the hidden panel met the chimney wall, thin slices of light appeared and disappeared as their hunters moved through the cabin below. "Where the hell are they?" Another voice, rougher, impatient. "The vehicles are still here. They're close." The first man again, calm and methodical. "Davis, check the storm cellar. Rodriguez, the attic. I want every inch of this place torn apart." Sarah pressed her face against the cool stone, trying to control her breathing. The baby was restless now, pressing against her diaphragm and making it even harder to stay quiet. She felt Marcus's hand find hers in the darkness, his grip steady despite everything. Minutes crawled by like hours. Below them, the systematic destruction of the cabin continued. Furniture scraped across floors, doors slammed open. The walls themselves seemed to shake under the assault. "Sir," a new voice, younger, uncertain. "There's something you should see." Footsteps converged directly beneath their hiding spot. Sarah held her breath as a beam of light swept across the fireplace opening below. "Fresh soot on the hearth," the young voice continued. "And look at these scuff marks on the stones." Sarah's blood turned to ice. They'd been careless, left evidence of their desperate climb. Marcus's grip tightened on her hand as they both realized what was coming. Interesting. The cultured voice was closer now, directly below them. Very interesting indeed. The sound of metal against stone echoed up through the chimney as someone began probing the fireplace with some kind of tool. Each scrape sent vibrations through the stonework, through Sarah's bones, through the terrified flutter of her unborn child's movements. "There," the voice said with satisfaction. "Hidden panel. Revolutionary War era, if I'm not mistaken. These old cabins are full of surprises." Sarah closed her eyes and prepared for the inevitable. In seconds, their sanctuary would become their tomb. The envelope crinkled softly against her chest. Evidence that had cost so many lives, evidence that might die with them in this forgotten corner of the mountains. The scraping stopped. Then, silence more terrifying than any sound. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was finding her own name buried deep in a subsidiary file. A pregnancy wasn't coincidental timing for discovering this cabin. Someone had been tracking her movements, her medical appointments, even her grocery purchases. The file contained photos of her leaving Dr. Martinez's office, timestamps of her visits to the pharmacy for prenatal vitamins, and a detailed analysis of her psychological profile following David's death. She was meant to find this place. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't about Marcus Chen's research or his disappearance. This was about her, about what David had discovered before he died, about the questions she might ask, the connections she might make. The cabin was a trap, baited with just enough truth to draw her in and keep her isolated while they decided what to do with her. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. "Beautiful morning, isn't it? The lake looks so peaceful from here." Sarah's hands trembled as she moved to the window. Through the trees, she caught a glint of sunlight reflecting off something metallic. Binoculars, maybe a rifle scope. They weren't just watching anymore. They were letting her know they were watching. She grabbed the laptop and portable drive, shoving them into her backpack along with the most damning documents. If they wanted to end this charade, she wouldn't make it easy for them. But as she headed for the back door, another message appeared. "Your baby deserves better than this. Walk out the front door with your hands visible. No technology. We just want to talk." The mention of her baby sent ice through her veins. These weren't idle threats. They knew exactly how to control her, but Sarah had learned something about herself in the past few days. Motherhood had awakened a fierce protectiveness she'd never known existed, and she refused to raise her child in a world where people like this operated with impunity. Instead of complying, she moved to Chen's workstation and initiated the program he'd built for emergency situations. If she was going down, she'd take their secrets with her. The system began uploading everything to multiple news outlets, law enforcement agencies, and international oversight organizations. It would take 12 minutes to complete. Her phone rang. This time she answered. "Miss Harrison." The voice was calm, professional, terrifyingly polite. "You're making this unnecessarily complicated." "Good," Sarah replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Complicated means people ask questions. We have a proposal. You disappear. New identity, new life, financial security for you and your child. All you have to do is walk away. And let you continue murdering people, selling weapons to terrorists. I've seen the files. You've seen carefully curated information designed to tell a specific story. The reality is far more nuanced." "Nuanced?" Sarah laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call the village in Syria that was destroyed by weapons you sold to both sides?" A pause. "You have 7 minutes to stop that upload and come outside, or we'll come in and retrieve you." "I'd prefer to avoid that scenario." "What happened to Marcus Chen?" "Mr. Chen was offered the same choice you're being offered. He made the wrong decision. So you killed him. We protected our interests. Just as we'll protect them now." Sarah ended the call and grabbed her backpack. The upload was only at 12%, but she could hear vehicles approaching on the access road. They were done talking. She triggered Chen's emergency protocols, watching as the cabin's security system activated. Steel shutters slammed down over the windows, and she heard the hiss of gas being released. Not lethal, but enough to slow down anyone trying to breach the building. 23% uploaded. Sarah found the hidden panel Chen had described in his notes and squeezed into the narrow tunnel. The space was tight, made worse by her pregnancy, but she forced herself forward into the darkness as shouts erupted from outside the cabin. Her child kicked as if sensing the danger, and Sarah whispered a promise into the suffocating blackness. "We're going to make them pay." The GPS coordinates led Sarah deeper into the mountains than she'd ever ventured, following a narrow dirt road that seemed to dissolve into wilderness with each passing mile. Her hands gripped the steering wheel of Marcus's Jeep, knuckles white against the worn leather. The baby kicked restlessly, as if sensing her mounting anxiety. She'd left the cabin before dawn, carrying only the encrypted drive and Marcus's detailed instructions. The rendezvous point was an abandoned fire lookout tower, where investigative journalist Elena Vasquez would be waiting. Elena had broken corporate corruption stories before. If anyone could help expose Blackwood Industries' conspiracy, it would be her. The tower came into view just as storm clouds gathered overhead, its skeletal frame rising against the grey sky like a monument to isolation. Sarah parked at the base and climbed out, scanning the area. A figure emerged from behind the structure, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and prematurely silver hair. "Sarah Mitchell?" Elena's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to dangerous meetings. "You came alone?" Sarah asked, instinctively placing a protective hand over her belly. "As promised. Though we don't have much time. My editor's already getting pressure from Blackwood's legal team. They know something's coming." Elena gestured toward the tower. "Let's talk up there. Better vantage point." They climbed the rickety stairs, each step groaning under their weight. At the top, Elena spread out a tablet and recording equipment on the weathered platform. "Marcus said you have evidence of their illegal trials." Sarah hesitated, then pulled out the drive. "Everything's on here. Patient files, financial records, communications between executives. They'd been using homeless populations and undocumented immigrants as test subjects for experimental drugs." Elena's face darkened as she scrolled through the files. "Jesus, this goes back 5 years. The casualty rate..." She looked up sharply. "Wait, these locations, there's one listed as Riverside Clinic. That's where my source disappeared 6 months ago." "Your source?" "Dr. James Chen. He was a Blackwood researcher who reached out about questionable protocols. We were supposed to meet, but he never showed." His colleagues said he'd taken sudden leave. Elena's fingers flew across the tablet. According to this, he was reassigned to something called Project Prometheus 3 days before our scheduled meeting. Sarah's blood chilled. She'd seen that name in William Ashford's personal files. Project Prometheus was his pet project, experimental cognitive enhancers designed for military applications. Thunder rumbled overhead as Elena continued digging through the data. Look at this. Payment authorizations to a company called Clearwater Security. I've seen that name before. They're mercenaries, ex-military types who handle asset protection for corporations, like cleaning up loose ends? Exactly. Elena's expression grew grim. Sarah, if they're willing to kill a researcher, they won't hesitate to eliminate anyone else who threatens this operation. As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from below. Sarah peered over the platform's edge and felt her heart stop. 3 black SUVs were climbing the mountain road, moving fast despite the rough terrain. They found us, she whispered. Elena was already packing up her equipment. The drive, is this the only copy? No. Marcus has backups hidden, but... Good. We need to separate. If they catch us together, the story dies with us. Elena pressed a business card into Sarah's hand. There's a number on the back. Memorize it, then destroy the card. If something happens to me, call that number and say Phoenix Protocol. They'll know what to do. They'll be watching it. Probably. But there's an old logging road about 2 miles downstream. If you can reach it. Elena trailed off, studying Sarah's pregnant form with concern. Can you make that hike? I have to. The first SUV crested the hill as Sarah began her descent down the trail. Behind her, she heard Elena calling out, drawing attention to herself. I'm alone up here, just doing some bird watching. The trail was steep and treacherous, made worse by loose rocks and her shifting center of gravity. Each step required careful consideration as she picked her way through dense undergrowth. The baby seemed to sense the danger, moving restlessly as her heart rate climbed. Voices echoed from the tower, Elena's defiant tone mixing with harsher, more threatening sounds. Sarah forced herself not to look back, focusing instead on the distant sound of running water that marked the river below. A gunshot cracked through the mountain air. Sarah stumbled, catching herself against a pine tree as the sound reverberated through the canyon. Her vision blurred with tears, but she kept moving. Elena had bought her this chance with her life. She couldn't waste it. The river appeared through the trees, its current swollen with recent rains. Sarah followed its banks eastward, her legs aching with each step. Somewhere behind her, men were hunting, following her trail through the wilderness. She had to reach that logging road, had to survive long enough to ensure Elena's sacrifice meant something. The conspiracy was bigger than she'd imagined, and now she was truly alone against it. The forest pressed against Sarah like a living thing as she crept through the underbrush, Marcus's hand steady on her lower back. Every snapping twig beneath their feet sounded like gunfire in the pre-dawn silence. The laptop bag bounced against her hip with each careful step, its contents worth more than most people's lives, including theirs. There, Marcus whispered, pointing through a gap in the pine trees. The old logging road. Sarah squinted through the gloom and made out the faint outline of tire tracks carved into the earth. Her breathing had grown labored over the past hour, each exhale forming small clouds in the frigid air. The baby seemed restless too, shifting and pressing against her ribs as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Marcus held up a hand, freezing mid-step. Sarah's heart hammered as she strained to hear what had caught his attention. Then she heard it too, the distant rumble of an engine echoing through the trees. "Down!" he hissed, pulling her behind a fallen log. The sound grew louder, definitely coming from the direction of the logging road. Sarah pressed her face against the rough bark, feeling splinters catch in her hair. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting their cramped hiding spot. A black SUV emerged from the morning mist, moving slowly along the rutted path. Its windows were tinted dark, but Sarah could see the outline of at least 2 figures inside. The vehicle paused directly across from their hiding spot. engine idling. Sarah held her breath until her lungs burned. The SUV's passenger door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, wearing military-style clothing and carrying what looked like a high-tech scanning device. He swept it in a slow arc across the forest, the device emitting soft beeping sounds. A thermal scanner, Marcus breathed against her ear, barely audible. The man was methodical, patient. He walked a few steps closer to their position, then stopped again to scan. The device's beeping intensified, and Sarah's blood turned to ice. The fallen log might hide them from view, but it wouldn't mask their body heat. Marcus's hand found hers, squeezing tight. She could see him calculating distances, angles, possibilities. But they both knew the truth. Pregnant and exhausted, she couldn't run, and he wouldn't leave her. The scanner beeped faster. The man took another step forward. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, but not from their pursuer. The man with the scanner spun around, shouting to his partner in the SUV. More shots followed, coming from somewhere deeper in the forest. Sarah caught a glimpse of muzzle flashes between the trees. "Move," Marcus whispered urgently. "Now, while they're distracted." They crawled along the log's length, using it as cover while the armed men focused on the source of the gunfire. Sarah's knees scraped against rocks and roots, but she forced herself to keep moving. Behind them, she could hear shouting, more vehicles arriving. When they reached the end of the log, Marcus helped her to her feet. They ran, or rather, Sarah stumbled while Marcus half-carried her, deeper into the forest, away from both the road and the mysterious gunfight. Who was shooting? Sarah gasped when they finally stopped to rest beside a small creek. "I don't know," Marcus replied, but his expression was troubled. "Could be hunters. Could be someone else looking for us. Could be Detective Morrison," Sarah finished. The thought had occurred to her too. Morrison had promised to help, but in this game of shifting loyalties, she wasn't sure if that made him friend or foe. Marcus knelt beside the creek, cupping water in his hands. "We need to keep moving. That distraction won't last long." Sarah nodded, though every muscle in her body screamed for rest. She thought about the files on the laptop, about Elena Vasquez's encrypted drives, about the network of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. Somewhere in that digital maze was the evidence that could bring down Whitmore and his conspirators, but only if they lived long enough to deliver it. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly as they prepared to move again. "Something I haven't told you about Morrison." Sarah's stomach clenched. "What?" "When I called him yesterday, before we lost cell service, he mentioned that Elena might not be dead, that the body they found might not be hers." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Elena alive? After everything they'd assumed, everything they'd built their plans around? "That's impossible," she whispered. "We saw the news reports." "News reports can be fabricated," Marcus said grimly, "especially when you have the kind of resources Whitmore has." Behind them, the gunfire had stopped. The forest had returned to its ominous silence. But Sarah knew their pursuers would be moving again soon. They had to keep running, keep fighting, keep searching for the truth in a world where nothing was certain except the life growing inside her. The burner phone's shrill ring cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs as she fumbled for the device on the nightstand. Marcus stirred beside her, instantly alert. "It's Elena," she whispered, seeing the number she'd memorized. Her thumb hovered over the answer button. They'd been waiting 3 days for this call. 3 days of growing paranoia and dwindling hope. "Sarah." Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, strained with exhaustion. "I have it, the smoking gun. But we have a problem. They know I'm onto them. Someone's been feeding them information from inside the Justice Department. I had to burn my cover and run." Static crackled through the line. "I'm at a truck stop outside Phoenix. They'll find me soon." Marcus leaned closer, his face grim in the phone's pale glow. "What did you find?" "Morrison's alive. Has been this whole time." The plane crash was staged. They needed him to disappear because he was going to expose Meridian's illegal mining operations on federal land. Billions in lithium deposits, Sarah. Enough to power half the country's electric grid for decades. Sarah's breath caught. She'd suspected Morrison was alive, but hearing it confirmed sent ice through her veins. Where is he? Facility in Nevada. They've been holding him, forcing him to transfer his assets piece by piece. The cabin where you found those documents? That was his insurance policy. He hid evidence there, knowing someone would eventually find it. A sharp pain lanced through Sarah's abdomen. She gasped, pressing her hand to her side. The baby had been restless all night, and now the contractions were getting stronger, more frequent. Sarah? Elena's voice sharpened with concern. I'm okay. Just the baby. Another contraction hit, stealing her breath. Elena, you need to get somewhere safe. There is no safe anymore. They've got resources we can't match. But I've uploaded everything to a secure server. Financial records, communication logs, proof of Morrison's imprisonment. If something happens to me, the passwords are in a safety deposit box in Flagstaff. Box 847, First National Bank. The keys taped under the sink in the ladies' room here. Marcus grabbed the phone. Elena, get out of there now. Find the nearest police station. Another contraction gripped Sarah, stronger this time. She doubled over, fighting waves of pain. Something's wrong, she whispered. The baby's coming too early. Marcus was already moving, gathering their pre-packed emergency bag. They'd prepared for this possibility, but not like this. Not with Elena in danger and their world collapsing around them. Sarah, you need to get to a hospital, Elena said. But be careful who you trust. They'll be watching for you. What about the evidence? What about Morrison? The recording is hidden in the cabin. Morrison was clever. He embedded it in the old radio in the kitchen. Pull out the back panel. There's a micro SD card taped inside. Get it to someone you trust completely, someone outside the system. The line went quiet, except for Elena's ragged breathing. In the background, Sarah could hear the rumble of trucks, the distant sound of diesel engines. They're here, Elena whispered suddenly. Black SUVs, 3 of them. Sarah, promise me something. Whatever happens to me, don't let them bury this truth. Morrison's been fighting for 8 months to expose what they've done. Don't let his sacrifice be for nothing. Elena, run! Too late. Remember, Box 847, First National in Flagstaff, the radio in the kitchen, and Sarah, trust Dr. Williams at Mercy General in Tucson. She helped Morrison's wife before they killed her. She's clean. The phone went dead. Sarah stared at the dark screen, tears streaming down her face. Another contraction hit, this one so intense she cried out. Marcus was beside her instantly, his hands gentle but urgent. We need to go, he said. Now. She nodded, forcing herself to focus through the pain. Elena was gone, possibly dead or captured. Morrison was still imprisoned somewhere in Nevada, and their baby was coming whether they were ready or not. As Marcus helped her to the car, Sarah looked back at the safe house that had sheltered them for the past week. Tomorrow, everything would change. Tonight, they had to survive. The basement of the warehouse smelled like rust and old concrete. Sarah pressed herself against the cold wall, her hand instinctively moving to her belly as footsteps echoed above. Marcus had insisted they move locations after the safe house was compromised, but this felt more like a tomb than sanctuary. They're closer than we thought, Marcus whispered, checking his phone. The blue glow illuminated the tension in his face. 3 more journalists who were investigating Blackwood Industries have gone missing in the past week. Sarah's blood ran cold. Missing or, we don't know. He pocketed the device. But their families haven't heard from them. The weight of what they'd uncovered pressed down on her like the tons of concrete above. Richard Blackwood's files hadn't just revealed corporate fraud. They'd exposed a network of corruption that reached into government agencies, multinational corporations, and organizations she'd never heard of, but apparently wielded enormous power. I keep thinking about what he wrote in that last entry, Sarah said, her voice barely audible. about how he realized he wasn't just stealing money, he was funding something much worse. Marcus nodded grimly. They'd found Blackwood's final journal hidden behind a false panel in the cabin's bedroom. His handwriting had grown increasingly erratic as he documented discovering that the funds he'd been siphoning were intended for human trafficking operations across 3 continents. He tried to back out, Marcus said. That's why they killed him. And now we have everything he died trying to expose. Sarah touched the encrypted drive hanging around her neck. Such a small thing to contain so much destruction. A car door slammed somewhere outside. They both froze. Marcus moved to the small window near the ceiling, peering through the grimy glass. 2 black SUVs, government plates. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. How did they find us? Doesn't matter now. He was already moving, grabbing their backpack and checking his weapon. There's a tunnel system that connects to the building next door. We can... The warehouse door exploded inward with a crash that seemed to shake the entire structure. Heavy boots thundered across the floor above, accompanied by shouted commands. Federal agents, building is surrounded. Sarah recognized the voice from the cabin. Agent Morrison, the man who'd claimed to be FBI but whose credentials Marcus had proven were fabricated. Whatever agency he really worked for, they weren't bound by constitutional protections. This way, Marcus hissed, leading her toward a metal grate in the far corner. He'd scouted their escape routes when they'd arrived, but Sarah had hoped they wouldn't need them. As he worked to remove the grate's screws with a multi-tool, Sarah heard something that made her stomach lurch, dogs barking. They'd brought tracking animals. Hurry, she breathed. The screws seemed to take forever. Above them, the search was methodical and thorough. Furniture scraped across the floor. Doors slammed. They were working their way systematically through the building. Finally, the grate came free. The tunnel beyond was narrow and dark, barely wide enough for one person. Marcus shined his phone's flashlight into the passage. I'll go first. Stay close and try not to think about what might be living in here. Sarah didn't need the reminder. She could already hear skittering sounds in the darkness. They crawled for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sarah's knees scraped against rough concrete, and her pregnant belly made the confined space even more claustrophobic. Behind them, she could hear muffled sounds that suggested the agents had found the basement. The tunnel ended at another grate, this one opening into what appeared to be an abandoned restaurant kitchen. Marcus carefully pushed it open and listened before emerging. Clear, he whispered, helping Sarah out. They were in a different world, dusty and forgotten, with old equipment covered in years of grime. But it was better than capture. Marcus checked his phone for signal. We need to get to the media contact tonight. Every hour we wait, more people disappear. What if they're watching the news stations too? They are. But Elena Martinez has been investigating Blackwood Industries independently. She's already suspicious of the official story about his disappearance. And she has protection we can't provide ourselves. Sarah thought about the investigative journalist who'd been exposing corporate corruption for 2 decades. If anyone could break this story without being silenced, it would be her. Once we hand over the evidence, Sarah said, there's no going back. They'll never stop hunting us. Marcus met her eyes in the dim light filtering through the dirty windows. They're never going to stop anyway. You know that, right? This isn't something we can run from forever. She did know. The conspiracy they'd uncovered was too vast, too profitable, and too dangerous to its architects to simply let witnesses walk away. Their only chance was to make the truth so public that silencing them would cause more problems than it solved. Then we end this tonight, Sarah said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Tonight, Marcus agreed. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. The encrypted files painted a picture of corruption so vast that Sarah's hands trembled as she scrolled through them. Marcus Chen's digital vault contained years of carefully documented evidence, offshore accounts, shell companies, bribery records, and most damning of all, detailed communications between Senator Victoria Ashford and defense contractors about artificially inflating military budgets. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if sensing her distress. Sarah pressed a hand to her belly, trying to steady her breathing. These weren't just financial crimes. They were treasonous acts that had funneled billions from national security into private pockets while soldiers went without proper equipment. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted message from Jake. Package delivered. Exit strategy compromised. They know about the cabin. Sarah's blood turned to ice. She grabbed the external drive, ejecting it from Marcus's computer system, and stuffed it into her jacket pocket, alongside the backup drive she'd prepared. Through the reinforced windows, she could see vehicle headlights snaking up the mountain road like deadly fireflies in the darkness. Moving as quickly as her pregnant body allowed, Sarah gathered the essential files and Marcus's laptop. Her own device was already packed in the emergency bag she'd kept ready by the door. The baby seemed to sense the urgency, settling lower in her pelvis with a pressure that made her gasp. "Not now," she pleaded silently. "Not yet." The hidden tunnel Marcus had shown her was her only chance. She triggered the bookshelf mechanism and slipped into the narrow passage just as the first vehicles reached the clearing outside. The tunnel was cramped and cold, forcing her to crawl through sections where her belly barely fit. Behind her she could hear voices and the sound of boots on the cabin's front porch. "Search everything," a woman's voice commanded. "Senator Ashford, find those files and find the girl." Sarah bit back a whimper as another contraction gripped her. The stress was triggering early labor. She was certain of it now. She had to reach the tunnel's exit before her body betrayed her completely. The passage seemed endless, each foot feeling like a mile. Her knees scraped against rough stone, and more than once she had to stop as waves of pain rolled through her abdomen. Behind her, the sounds of systematic destruction echoed through the tunnel as they tore Marcus's sanctuary apart. Finally, she emerged into the forest a quarter-mile from the cabin. The cold mountain air hit her like a slap, but she forced herself to keep moving. The rendezvous point Jake had specified was another half-mile through dense woods, an old fire tower where he'd hidden supplies and established a secure communication link. Every step was agony now. The contractions were coming closer together, and she could feel fluid trickling down her legs. Her water had broken. The baby was coming whether she was ready or not. She stumbled through the underbrush, using trees for support, clutching the laptop bag against her chest like a lifeline. The evidence it contained was worth more than her life. It could bring down an entire network of corruption that reached the highest levels of government. Voices carried through the forest behind her. They'd found the tunnel. "She can't have gone far." Ashford's voice cut through the night. "She's 9 months pregnant, for God's sake. Spread out and find her." Sarah pressed herself against a massive pine tree, trying to muffle her labored breathing. A contraction hit so hard she nearly cried out, biting her lip until she tasted blood. The baby was coming fast now, too fast. Through the trees ahead, she could see the skeletal frame of the fire tower silhouetted against the star-filled sky. So close, but she wasn't sure she could make it. Her legs felt like water, and each contraction left her weaker than the last. She heard footsteps approaching and forced herself to move, half running, half stumbling toward the tower. Behind her, a flashlight beam swept through the trees where she'd been hiding moments before. The fire tower's ladder stretched 30 feet into the darkness. Under normal circumstances, it would have been an easy climb. Now, it looked impossible. But at the top, Jake had promised safety, a helicopter extraction that would get her and the evidence to federal authorities who could be trusted. Another contraction doubled her over as she reached the base of the tower. She gripped the first rung of the ladder, steel cold against her palms. Above her, she could see a faint light. Jake signaled that the extraction was ready. "There!" a voice shouted from the forest. "The tower!" Sarah started climbing, one rung at a time, as gunshots rang out below her. Bullets pinged off the steel structure as she hauled herself higher, the laptop bag banging against her back with each movement. The evidence would survive this night, even if she didn't. The baby kicked one more time, strong and defiant, as if promising to fight alongside her mother until the very end. The USB drive felt like a burning coal in Sarah's palm as she crouched behind the dumpster, Marcus's blood still warm on her jacket. The warehouse district stretched before them in a maze of shadows and flickering streetlights, but she knew their pursuers weren't far behind. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed off the concrete walls. "We need to get this to someone who can broadcast it," she whispered to Detective Riley, who was applying pressure to a makeshift bandage on his shoulder. "The media, the FBI, anyone who can't be bought." Riley grimaced as he adjusted his position. "There's a news station about 6 blocks from here, Channel 7. I know someone there who owes me a favor." He paused, studying her face in the dim light. "But Sarah, once we do this, there's no going back. These people will never stop hunting you." She placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby stir restlessly inside her. Everything she'd learned was on that drive. Evidence of Blackstone's fake death, the illegal weapons deals, the murdered whistleblowers, the conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government. Marcus had died to get her this information. She wouldn't let his sacrifice be meaningless. "They're already hunting me," she said, standing despite the exhaustion that threatened to buckle her knees. "At least this way, the world will know why." They moved through the industrial maze, staying low and avoiding the main streets. Behind them, searchlights swept the area where they'd been hiding, and the sound of barking dogs grew closer. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs as they reached the edge of the warehouse district. The news station sat like a beacon 6 blocks away, its red transmission light blinking against the night sky. But between them and safety lay open ground, streets with nowhere to hide if Caldwell's men spotted them. "Wait," Riley said, grabbing her arm. "Black SUVs, 3 of them." Sarah followed his gaze and saw the vehicles positioned at strategic intersections, their occupants scanning the area with military precision. They were trapped. "There's another way," she said suddenly, remembering something from her weeks of running, the storm drains. "I used them to move around the city when I was staying in that abandoned building downtown." Riley looked skeptical, but the sound of approaching footsteps made the decision for them. They found a maintenance cover in the alley and pried it open, dropping into the concrete tunnel below. The smell of stagnant water and urban decay filled Sarah's nostrils, but she pressed forward, using her phone's flashlight to navigate. The tunnels were a labyrinth, but Sarah had studied them during her desperate weeks of hiding. They emerged 4 blocks closer to the station, surfacing in an alley behind a 24-hour diner. The smell of bacon and coffee seemed surreal after everything they'd been through. "Almost there," Riley said, but his voice was weaker now. Blood had seeped through his bandage. They made their final approach to Channel 7, moving from car to car in the parking lot. The building looked quiet, but Sarah could see lights in the newsroom on the 2nd floor. This was it, their one chance to expose everything. "Miss Chen," Caldwell said, his voice conversational despite the gun in his hand. "You've led us quite a chase." Riley tried to reach for his weapon, but 2 men emerged from behind nearby cars, their rifles trained on him. Sarah felt the USB drive dig into her palm as she clenched her fist around it. "You killed Marcus," she said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "Mr. Rodriguez chose his loyalty poorly," Caldwell replied. "As have you. That information you're carrying is built on incomplete data and conspiracy theories. No one will believe it. Want to bet?" Sarah shot back. Caldwell's smile widened. "Actually, yes, because even if some fringe outlets pick up the story, we have resources you can't imagine. Discrediting sources, manipulating evidence, creating reasonable doubt. It's what we do best. Your accusations will be buried under an avalanche of counter-narratives and character assassination." The awful thing was, Sarah realized he might be right. The powerful had weathered bigger storms than this. But then she felt the baby kick, and something fierce and protective flared inside her. "Maybe," she said. "But at least people will start asking questions." In one fluid motion, She hurled the USB drive toward the news station's entrance. It skittered across the pavement as Caldwell cursed and his men lunged forward. Riley, despite his injuries, threw himself at the nearest gunman. Sarah ran toward the building, screaming at the top of her lungs, "Help! They're trying to kill me! I have evidence of murder!" Lights began turning on in windows. Faces appeared. Someone was recording with their phone. The truth was finally getting out. The courthouse steps gleamed wet under the morning drizzle as Sarah adjusted her coat over her rounded belly. 6 months had passed since that terrible night at the cabin, and the world had changed in ways she never could have imagined. The Meridian conspiracy had unraveled thread by thread, taking down senators, corporate executives, and shadow operatives who had operated with impunity for decades. Detective Martinez emerged from the courthouse entrance, his face grim but satisfied. "Henderson got life without parole," he said, approaching Sarah and David. "Cartwright took a plea deal, 25 years, the last of them." Sarah nodded, feeling a weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying finally lift from her shoulders. "And the families of the whistleblowers?" "Compensated. The Victims Fund approved everything yesterday." Martinez pulled out his phone, showing her a news headline. "The legislation passed too. The Meridian Act. Mandatory protection for corporate whistleblowers, criminal penalties for retaliation." David squeezed Sarah's hand. "You did this. All of it." She looked down at her belly, where their daughter moved restlessly. They'd decided to name her Grace, after Sarah's grandmother, who had taught her that truth was worth fighting for, no matter the cost. "We did this." The past months had been a whirlwind of testimonies, depositions, and media attention that Sarah had never wanted, but had learned to navigate. The video footage from Blackwood's hidden cameras, combined with the financial records Sarah had photographed, had provided prosecutors with an ironclad case. But it was Sarah's testimony, clear, compelling, and unwavering despite the defense attorney's attempts to discredit her, that had sealed their fate. "There's something else," Martinez said, his tone shifting. "We found him." Sarah's breath caught. "Blackwood?" With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the envelope Martinez handed her. Blackwood's handwriting was shaky, desperate. "If you're reading this, then you succeeded where I failed. I created Meridian to change the world, but I let it become a monster. The cabin was my refuge from what I'd built, but there's no refuge from conscience. You have the courage I lost. Protect your child. Make sure this never happens again." JB said, "He knew," Sarah whispered. At the end, he knew what he'd done. A black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Sarah tensed instinctively before recognizing Agent Torres behind the wheel. Old habits died hard. Torres approached with a folder in her hands. "The last of the international accounts have been frozen," Torres reported. "The Swiss banks finally cooperated. We're talking about $2.8 billion that will go back to the communities Meridian damaged." She handed Sarah the folder. "Including the scholarship fund you requested." Sarah opened it to see the documents establishing the Grace Foundation, educational scholarships for children whose parents had been killed or silenced for trying to expose corporate wrongdoing. The irony wasn't lost on her that Blackwood's blood money would now protect the families of people like herself. David's phone buzzed. "The movers are finished," he said. "The new house is ready whenever you are." They'd bought a place outside the city, far from the memories but close enough for Sarah to continue her work with the Congressional Oversight Committee. She'd been offered a permanent position investigating corporate malfeasance, using her experience as both victim and survivor to help others who found themselves caught in similar webs of corruption. As they walked toward their car, Sarah caught sight of a familiar figure across the street. Dr. Amanda Walsh, the physician who had helped them that first night, waved from outside her new clinic. The Meridian settlement had allowed her to open a practice serving undocumented immigrants and other vulnerable populations. She'd testified about the pressure she'd faced to stay silent, helping prosecutors understand the full scope of the conspiracy's reach. "Any regrets?" David asked, as they drove away from the courthouse for the last time. Sarah considered the question seriously. The past year had cost her so much: her anonymity, her sense of safety, her faith in institutions she'd once trusted. But it had also given her something unexpected: purpose, the knowledge that her courage had prevented other families from suffering as hers had. "No," she said finally, feeling Grace kick against her ribs as if in agreement. No regrets. The rain had stopped, and sunlight broke through the clouds as they drove toward their new life. In the rearview mirror, the courthouse disappeared behind them, but Sarah knew the work wasn't finished. It never would be completely. There would always be powerful people who believed they were above consequences, who thought they could silence truth with money or threats. But there would also always be people willing to fight back, to risk everything for what was right. Sarah had learned she was one of them, and someday, when Grace was old enough to understand, she would tell her daughter about the importance of speaking truth to power, no matter how dangerous it might be.